"Don't go in there, boy." The words ripped through the evening air, sharp and urgent, but the German shepherd named Kale didn't flinch. He stood rigid outside the weathered barn, muscles quivering, ears pinned forward as though every sound inside clawed at his bones. His amber eyes reflected a wild mix of fear and determination. The man who had shouted "the farmer," Elias, stood a few yards away, frozen, his voice cracking not from anger but from something heavier, something close to dread. The barn loomed in front of them, its wooden slats dark with age, its roof sagging as if it bore the weight of secrets long kept. The air smelled of hay and damp earth, but beneath it was another odor, faint, unsettling, almost metallic. It carried the suggestion of something hidden, something wrong. Kale's paws pressed deeper into the dirt, his whole body leaning toward the barn door, and then it came, a sound so small, so fragile, that both dog and man fell into silence. A cry, thin, trembling, a kitten's cry. Elias's chest tightened. He had heard plenty of strays around the farm before, but this one sounded different, desperate in a way that clawed straight into him. Yet what chilled him more was Kale's reaction. The shepherd's throat rumbled with a low growl, not of hostility but of warning, as if the barn itself had swallowed the cry-hole and fed it back as a dare. "Easy, Kale," Elias whispered now, his earlier sharpness gone. His boots shifted in the dirt, betraying hesitation he didn't want the dog to see. He had locked that barn weeks ago after storms tore down half the roof. Nothing should have been inside. No cats, no animals, nothing. And yet the faint mew rose again, stretching through the silence like a thread of fear pulling them both closer. Kale moved first. With a sudden lunge he pressed his nose against the old door, claws scraping against splintered wood. Elias swore under his breath and hurried forward, hands fumbling at the rusty latch, his mind filled with questions he couldn't slow down enough to answer. Had something crawled in? Was something trapped? Or worse, had someone put it there? The door groaned open, a cry of wood meeting air, and the stench hit them harder. Rot, old hay dampness, and something that didn't belong, something sharp like rust and dust tangled together. Kale slipped inside before Elias could stop him, his shape vanishing into shadow. Elias followed, lantern in hand, its flicker trembling. Across broken boards and abandoned tools. At first, there was nothing but silence, save for Kale's heavy breathing as he prowled deeper. Then the cry again, closer now, but warped by the barn's hollow echo. Elias's heart lurched. He raised the lantern higher, its light catching on the shattered beams above, the curling straw at their feet, and then on Kale himself, standing rigid by a heap of hay, the shepherd's head tilted low, his ears sharp as blades, his tail stiff with unease. Elias stepped closer, lantern shaking in his grip. "What is it?" His voice cracked, too loud in the cavernous dark. The hay shifted. Elias froze. Something moved beneath it. The cry tore out again, louder, filled with a raw desperation that scraped against every nerve. Kale barked once, sharp and commanding, the sound echoing like a shot. Elias dropped to his knees, thrusting the lantern aside so both hands could pull away the hay. Straw scattered, dust rose, and then there it was. A kitten no bigger than his palm, its fur mottled with grime, its eyes wide pools of terror. Its tiny chest heaved with each ragged cry, but it wasn't alone. Elias's breath caught in his throat as the light revealed the shape beside it of great heavy rusted nails jutting from its edges, and from within the narrow slats, something else, a second pair of eyes. Not wide and innocent like the kitten's, but glassy, unmoving, their dullness whispering of silence too long kept. Elias jerked back, horror cutting into him like a blade. Kale wind, circling, his body tense as if waiting for something to strike. The kitten wailed, wriggling weakly against the straw, reaching not toward Elias but toward the Kretaz, though begging for something it could not understand was already gone. Elias swallowed hard, his voice barely finding its way out. Who did this? The question hung in the barn's stale air unanswered, as the lantern's flame flickered against walls that seemed suddenly too close to suffocating. Kale pressed his body against Elias, grounding him, eyes locked not on the kitten but deeper into the barn's shadows. Elias followed his gaze. The lantern light barely touched the far corner, but even in that darkness he felt Ktten unseen presence, heavy, watching. The kitten cried again, the sound sharper now, urgent, like a plea to be heard. Elias reached out, trembling, and lifted it from the hay. It was impossibly light, bones fragile as twigs beneath his rough hands. Kale nosed at the tiny creature, gentle, protective, and for a moment Elias almost let himself breathe. But the silence that followed pressed down harder than any storm, and in it grew a truth he could not ignore. The kitten hadn't gotten here by accident, and whatever had placed it here might not be gone. Elias held the trembling kitten against his chest, feeling its tiny heartbeat flutter like a fragile drum inside a hollow room. The warmth of its body should have been comforting, but all it did was remind him how cold the rest of the barn felt, how unnatural the silence had become after its cry. Kale pressed close, his body tense, the fur along his back raised in sharp ridges. His gaze never wavered from the far corner, where the shadows clung too thickly, as though they were hiding something Elias could not yet see. The lantern's glow wavered as Elias shifted, throwing long, uneasy shapes across the barn walls. He tried to focus on the kitten, but his eyes kept darting back to the crate. He couldn't unsee the glassy eyes staring through those rusted slats, the lifeless weight of them. Whoever left this kitten here had done more than abandon it, had left it to mourn. Elias's throat burned with an anger he hadn't felt in years, a hot wave of betrayal against a stranger he hadn't even met. Kale's growl deepened, soft but relentless, pulling Elias's attention again toward the darkness. The dog's instincts had saved him before, once from a rattlesnake coiled too close to the porch. Another time when a neighbor's bull had broken through the fence. If Kale was this uneasy, something was wrong. Elias tightened his grip on the lantern, lifting it higher, its light spilling reluctantly into the farthest reaches of the barn. The dust seemed to shiver in the beam, but for an instant he thought he saw movement to flicker. The brief shift of something retreating just beyond the reach of sight. "Show yourself," Elias muttered, though his voice cracked, betraying fear he didn't want to name. His call was answered only by the groan of the rafters overhead, the sound of wood settling like an old man's sigh. Still, Kale barked once, sharp and commanding, his entire frame leaning forward, daring whatever lurked there to reveal itself. The kitten stirred in Elias's hands, mewing again, the sound piercing, desperate. He felt its claws prick through his shirt as it squirmed, not toward him but toward the crate, as if begging him not to forget what lay inside. Elias knelt back down beside the box, heart thudding. The smell of rust and rot thickened in his throat as he brushed his hand along the lid. The nails were bent in strange angles, hammered fast as though whoever sealed it wanted it shut for good. With trembling fingers, he pried at the wood, his strength warring with hesitation, until the top splintered open. Inside, straw lined the bottom, but it was matted dark with stains that made his stomach twist. There were fragments of cloth, too, torn and damp, as though wrapped around something once alive. Elias staggered back, the lantern slipping in his grip, flame flaring as it caught on his ragged breath. He didn't need to dig further to know what he had found was no accident. Someone had used this barn to bury their cruelty, and now that cruelty was bleeding back into his world. Kale snarled. Suddenly, snapping Elias back to the present, the shepherd bolted toward the shadows, paws striking the dirt with thunderous rhythm. The kitten squealed at the sudden noise, burrowing into Elias's chest for safety. Elias turned the lantern, but the light swung wildly, catching only gleam of something metallic, the blur of movement against the boards. Kale lunged, barking furiously, his voice colliding with the walls in a storm of sound. "Kale!" Elias shouted, stumbling after him. The lantern beam finally caught on something. In the corner, a small pile of tools lay scattered. Shovels and rakes long abandoned, but one was fresh, its edge glinting with recent use. Next to it, half hidden under an old tarp, was a sack, its fabric damp and dark. Kale tore at it with his teeth, dragging it into the light. Elias's stomach sank. The sack writhed. He dropped the lantern onto the dirt, freeing his hands. Kneeling, he pulled the sack open with trembling urgency. Out tumbled another kitten, its fur matted, its body limp but breathing. Behind it, two more lay tangled together, one mewling weakly, the other terrifyingly still. Elias felt his chest cave in as the truth struck him. Someone had meant to discard them, bury them under hay in silence, and left them to die alone in the shadows. The rage that had simmered in him before now roared to life. He scooped the surviving kittens out, laying them gently against the first one, watching Kale circle around them with the kind of restless protection only a guardian could give. The shepherd wind, licking one of the weaker kittens, nudging it as if to will it back to life. Elias's throat ached with the weight of it all, the cruelty, the loss, the sheer fight still clinging to these fragile creatures. But then something shifted again, faint yet undeniable. From above, a creak. The rafters, heavy with age, groaned once more. This time it wasn't the sigh of an old barn, it was footsteps. Slow, deliberate, measured against the wood in a way that turned Elias's blood to ice. He froze. The kittens pressed close to him, Kale bristling with fury at his side. The lantern flame quivered in the draft as though it, too, knew they weren't alone. And in that moment, Elias realized this wasn't just a cruel accident. Someone had been here. Someone might still be here. And the barn wasn't finished giving up its secrets. Elias hadn't slept much since that night in the barn. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the kittens' cry cutting through the silence. The kind of cry that didn't just beg for help but demanded it. Kale hadn't left its side either. The shepherd guarded the tiny creature as if it had always been his, curling his body protectively around the basket where Elias had laid it to rest. But beneath that fragile moment of safety lay a question that festered like a wound. Who had left it there, and why? The morning after, Elias tried to convince himself it was nothing more than misfortune astray, abandoned in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the image of that crate in the hay haunted him, the dull eyes staring through the slats, the heavy nails hammered shut. That wasn't chance, it was intent, and intent carried weight. Every time he walked past the barn, he felt its walls pressing in, whispering of things hidden in the dark. Kale sensed it, too, The dog no longer prowled the fields with his usual ease. Instead, he stayed close, ears pricked, eyes scanning the tree line as if expecting something to emerge. Once Elias caught him growling low at the shadows that pooled at the edge of the farm, and for the first time in years, Elias felt unsafe on his own land. By the third night, the air grew heavier, thicker, as though the farm itself held its breath. Elias was in the kitchen when Kale's sudden bark shattered the stillness. It wasn't the playful sound of greeting, nor the quick bark at a rabbit darting across the yard. This was sharp, commanding, full of urgency. Elias's heart lurched as he grabbed the lantern and rushed outside. The barn loomed again, silent except for Kale's growls. The shepherd stood stiff at the door, fur bristling, his body angled like a shield. Elias raised the lantern high, the light quivering across the cracked wood, and that's when he saw it. The door, the latch he had fastened himself, was no longer locked. It dangled loose, swinging against the wood with a hollow clink. His breath caught in his throat. He knew he had secured it. He remembered the way the metal had resisted under his hands, remembered the snap of it falling shut. Someone had been here. Someone had undone it. Before Elias could move, Kale lunged, pushing the door wide. The lantern's glow spilled inside, illuminating hay strewn across the floor, tools out of place, and in the center empty space where the crate had been. Elias staggered forward, the light dancing across the dirt, confirming what his gut already knew. It was gone. Whoever had left it there had come back, but the kitten, his eyes darted to the corner where the small basket had been kept. Relief flooded him when he saw Kale standing over it, the tiny creature still curled safely inside, unaware of the shadows closing around them. Elias dropped to one knee, clutching the lantern tight, his pulse hammered in his ears. This was no longer about a stray or an accident. Someone was playing with them, and the game was far from harmless. A noise broke the silence, then a sharp snap would under strain. Elias spun, the lantern swinging wildly. It came from the loft above, the old boards groaning under weight that should not have been there. Kale's growl deepened, teeth bared, gaze locked on the rafters. Elias forced his voice steady, though fear trembled in it. "Who's there?" No answer, only the sound of something shifting, slow and deliberate, as if testing whether to step forward or retreat. Elias's knuckles whitened around the lantern handle. He felt exposed, like prey caught under a hunter's eye. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was thicker than before, almost suffocating. Elias strained to hear, but the loft gave nothing back. Kale barked once, snapping the air, but even he hesitated to move closer. The dog's body language said enough. Whatever had been there was real, and it was watching. Elias backed toward the door, every instinct screaming to get out, to put distance between himself and whatever lingered above. But as he stepped into the night air, the kitten's cry pierced the silence again, louder this time, sharper, a plea that made his chest tighten. He glanced back, torn between fear and duty. He couldn't abandon it, not now, not after everything. He crouched beside the basket, lifting the tiny creature into his arms, its warmth pressed against him, trembling but alive. Kale circled close, ears pricked, eyes darting between Elias and the barn's shadowed loft. The farmer whispered almost to himself, his voice cracked and low, "They wanted you gone, but you're still here." As he carried the kitten out, Kale following at his heel, the night felt colder, darker than before. The barn door creaked behind them, settling shut with a groan, as though swallowing its secrets once again. Elias didn't look back, but deep in his bones he knew this wasn't finished. Whoever had returned would come again, and next time, they might not be satisfied with only taking the crate. Elias had thought the barn's silence was the heaviest weight he could bear, but as night deepened, the quiet grew stranger, more intrusive, as though the walls themselves were straining to hold back what lurked behind them. Kale had not relaxed. The shepherd paced the dirt floor with restless steps, his nails scratching against stone, his head snapping toward the shadows at the faintest sound. The kitten, now wrapped in Elias's worn jacket, whimpered against his chest, its small body shivering despite the warmth. Every cry pierced through Elias's ribs, hollowing him. But it wasn't the sound that unnerved him most, it was Kale's unrelenting vigilance. Elias tried to anchor himself in reason. The kitten was here, alive, trembling but breathing. That should have been enough. Yet his eyes kept drifting back to the crate in the corner, its splintered edges blackened with rot, its nails twisted as though bent by hands not meant to touch. Fragile things. The memory of those lifeless eyes staring through the slats gnawed at him, refusing to fade. He had not opened the crate fully, had not dared to face what he already knew was there. But Kale wouldn't leave it alone. The shepherd circled it again and again, nose pressed to the gaps, tail stiff, body tense, like a soldier standing guard over a battlefield no one else could see. "Leave it," Elias murmured, but the words tasted hollow. He had spoken them more to himself than to the dog. Kale growled low, his body refusing to obey, and in that sound Elias heard something deeper than instinct. It was recognition, as though Kale understood that the shadows were not empty, that the cries had been placed here with intent. The lantern flickered, casting warped shapes across the rafters. Elias swallowed hard, his throat dry, and tightened his grip on the kitten. He told himself it was exhaustion, the long hours on the farm, the weight of storms that had left more ruin than repair. But when the wind pressed against the cracked boards of the barn, the sound it made was not like the wind at all. It was sharper, closer, almost like the scrape of wood against nails. Elias froze, eyes wide, and Kale barked, a sudden blast that shattered the air. The kitten cried louder, pressing its face deeper into Elias's chest. His heart hammered as he moved toward the far corner. Lantern stretched ahead. The crate sat silent, its shadows stretching wide as though they reached beyond their boundaries. Elias knelt and pulled at the top plank, the wood groaning in protest. The lantern light spilled inside, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. The kitten hadn't been alone. There had been others, small, frail bodies curled together once, now reduced to silence. Elias's hand shook so violently he nearly dropped the lantern. He forced himself to turn away, bile rising in his throat, the sight too raw, too cruel. Kale pressed close to him, nudging his leg, grounding him in the present. But Elias's mind reeled. Who would do this, and why here, in his barn? The question burned, sharper than grief. The kitten squirmed in his arms, mewling weakly, and he knew it had survived by chance, or by some design that twisted deeper than his understanding. He stumbled back into the open space of the barn, gulping the air, though it carried only dust and damp. His voice came out hoarse, broken by the strain of disbelief. Someone left them here, Kale. Someone new. The words echoed, small and fragile, swallowed by the barn's dark. The shepherd's gaze never left the shadows. Then came the sound that shattered everything, a creak. Not from the wind, not from his touch, something deliberate. The door he had left half open shifted against its frame with a slow drag, and Elias's blood turned cold. Kale lunged forward, body rigid, his growl rising into a roar that filled the barn. Elias clutched the kitten tighter, his chest constricting with dread. He moved to the door, each step heavier than the last, lantern raised high. The night outside was thick, its silence unnatural. Nothing stirred, not the crickets, not the tree zone. The faint rustle of leaves bending under weight they should not bear. Elias's pulse thudded in his ears. Someone had been here. Maybe. Still was he backed into the barn, shutting the door until it latched, the sound final, sealing them in. Kale stood at his side, hackles high, his breath steady but forceful. Elias lowered his eyes to the kitten, whose cries had softened into exhausted whimpers, and something in him shifted. Fear no longer felt like enough. Whoever had done this had meant for the cries to be heard, meant for someone to find them. And that thought carried a danger far heavier than the night. The lantern trembled in his hand as he turned to Kale. "We're not alone," he whispered, and the words hung in the air like a vow, pressing them forward toward a truth that was waiting, dark and merciless. Just beyond the edge of light, the night had not loosened its grip, but something inside Elias had shifted. Fear still clung to him, but it no longer ruled him. Holding the tiny bundle of fur against his chest, he felt its faint heartbeat, fragile yet defiant, and in that rhythm there was something stronger than terror. Kale stayed pressed close, his body a barrier, his gaze locked on every shadow. The barn seemed smaller now, its dark corners no longer infinite voids but walls that could be faced. Elias drew in a steady breath, not because the air was clean, it wasn't, but because he had decided he would no longer let the silence dictate the end of the story. He crouched and set the kitten down on a bed of straw, Kale immediately lowering his head to nuzzle it gently, the dog's presence softening the animal's cries into a trembling calm. Elias's chest ached at the sight, the shepherd standing guard, not out of instinct alone, but something deeper, something human in its devotion. Elias touched Kale's back and felt the warmth, the steady power that had kept him from falling apart. In that moment he realized the barn, with all its shadows and the terrible truth it held, no longer felt like a place of endings. It was now a place where something had survived, where hope had refused to be buried. The memory of the crate still tore at him, its weight unbearable, but the kitten's small voice reminded him that not all had been lost. Elias lifted his eyes to the broken beams above and felt the first fragile resolve take root inside him. Someone had tried to abandon life here, to discard it as though it meant nothing, but Kale had waited. The dog had known the cries mattered, and because of that, Elias had heard them. That knowledge settled deep within him, sharper than grief, heavier than fear. It was purpose. He rose, the lantern steady now, and looked once more toward the sealed door. Whoever had left the kitten here, whoever had stolen its chance and smothered the others, was gone into the dark. But Elias knew he would not carry only anger forward. He would carry the life still breathing against the odds. He would carry the image of Kale standing guard, unflinching. He would carry the truth that even in silence, cries can be heard if someone listens long enough. That kitten stirred, its eyes opening wider, and for the first time Elias saw not only fear in them but possibility. Kale nudged the small creature closer, and Elias felt a swell in his chest that pushed back against the night. He reached down, gathering both dog and kitten with his gaze, and his voice came low, steady, a vow spoken into the stillness. "We'll protect you. You're safe now." The lantern's flame wavered but did not die. Kale's breathing eased, the kitten's cry faded into a hush, and in that quiet, Elias felt something deeper than dread. It was the weight of survival, fragile yet unyielding, and it left him with a truth that would linger long after the barn's shadows had emptied life, however small, is worth waiting for.